right, my friends, let's do this. My name is David Parsons. You are listening to Nostalgia Trap, your guide to the many traps of the 21st century. Today, we're talking about the housing trap. I am very grateful to our friend Andrew Schustek for recording a series of conversations with folks that are writing and thinking and researching about the absolutely horrifying housing situation in the United States in the 21st century. I mean, I don't know if it's just a perception, and I know that Andrew and our guest today will get into this, but it feels like since the pandemic, housing and rent have just become absolutely insane and unmanageable for a huge chunk of the American population. I include myself. I'm a renter too. I worry about the stability of my housing situation, probably in a way that's not as bad as many others, honestly. But it's been bad in my life, and it's been something I thought about. And honestly, I would say whatever my kind of attitudes towards capitalism might be, which have been explored on this show many times, I think it's through rent and landlords that I understood how this stuff touches us more deeply than the kind of abstract capitalist kind of theory stuff you hear in graduate school. The rent is too damn high. Everybody can understand that, right? And having landlords or property owners have this much power over us is honestly terrifying. It's something that creates a feeling of insecurity and precarity in my life and in the life of millions of others that is pretty devastating. So I don't want to be hopeless here. I want to talk about what's happening in the housing world, and I don't know enough about it. So Andrew is someone who does know a lot about it and has a lot of friends that can tell us something about what's going on in housing, particularly in New York City. Andrew's guest today is Charlie Dulik. He wrote this great piece in the Baffler. I'll link it in the episode description. It's out right now. It's called Pity the Landlord. And it's about this whole kind of mythology of the mom and pop landlord. The people who are just regular middle-class folks who happen to own some property and are making their income from tenants paying rent. That idea and that figure is a controversial one and a weaponized one. And what Charlie writes about in this piece is about how the image and mythology of the small mom-and-pop landlord is, at this point, a big part of the strategy of property owners in creating almost like an identity politics around being a landlord. And it's got race, it's got gender, it's got class. This story is insane, and this conversation is really fun and really illuminating. So I hope you enjoy it. Go check out the rest of Charlie's stuff. Again, I'll have all of it linked in the episode description. And while you're at it, go check out the Nostalgia Trap Patreon page. What's really cool about Patreon now is you can do a free trial. You don't have to just pay and in order to listen to this stuff. You can do a free trial for 7 days and listen to the entire Nostalgia Trap catalog going back 10 years, including all of our videos and our history lectures, etc. Tons of stuff on there you can check out for 7 days for free. So do check that out. Again, link is in the episode description. Appreciate everyone who subscribes and listens. We have lots more coming for you. I'm very excited for the future few months here on Nostalgia Trap. So join up and listen to what we're doing. Really appreciate it. And check out this interview. This is Andrew Schustek talking with Charlie Dulik on the housing trap.
Charlie, Nostalgia Trap series, housing trap. We've been trying to make this happen for quite some time.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. Excited to talk about, what a fun subject.
Yeah, small landlords, this very non-controversial and super easy to talk about thing, especially in New York. Um, Not to make you blush too much here, but I think your writing in the Baffler and in the New York Review of Architecture has been really critical for me and for a lot of other folks to think through political economy of housing and built environment and all that fun stuff. So I really just want to encourage listeners to check out your work at the Baffler and at the New York Review of Architecture and elsewhere. Um,
Yeah.
just a writer. You are a tenant organizer yourself. So I would love to hear a little bit about how that influences your work, how you came to it, and what you do on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. So, I mean, in regards to this piece specifically, um, there were all of these narratives that being involved in political work and tenants' rights work, going up to Albany to try and pass good cause eviction and any other tenant legislation. I started to hear about kind of what the other side is saying, and at first thinking, wow, this is ridiculous. This is how can anyone believe this? And then seeing that it's actually incredibly influential. So I mean, I've always kind of been interested in what the other side is saying, and I think some of the other pieces I've written have been about that. And then just doing tenant organizing work every day and seeing how landlords of all sizes screw people over and leave people in horrible circumstances.
And when you say tenant organizing work, what does that entail?
Oh yeah, so I mean, I'm going to buildings every week, almost every day, helping tenants who are dealing with anything from mold, leaks, no repairs, to outright harassment, to rent overcharge, to facing eviction, helping those folks navigate that situation. I think generally the best way to do that is with collective action. If one person in a building is facing any of those serious problems from a landlord, I guarantee that other people are, and their best course of action is to come together and fight against that. Again, a number of ways that can happen, from a lawsuit to a rent strike to any number of things. And then I think to kick it up one more level, bringing those collectives from buildings into a community and statewide coalition is the best way to then advance tenant power and in a legislative sense, which is obviously not everything, but can sure help a lot of people.
Amazing. And so, tenant organizer, you've been dealing with some of the issues that are small landlords, the backbone of our New York City society, or so. If you read the New York Post, you might think. Can you tell us a little bit about your piece, "Pity the Landlord"? Because I thought it did an incredible job at sort of exploring whether the mom and pop sort of framework was useful for discussing uh, housing in New York City. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the framing sort of pieces of your piece, Lincoln Eccles.
Yeah, totally. So I think in general, the piece is hoping to track how landlords have responded to the last 3 or 4 years of turmoil, starting with a major legislative loss in New York in 2019, kind of the first time in decades that that powerful group had ever not just been able to pick up the phone and call the governor and get what they want. And then of course the pandemic hits, and there's a brief period where people are wondering, wow, is New York real estate going to be done forever? Are these people are going to be out of business? There's also a rising tenant movement, and general movement in the streets of people saying cancel rent, cancel evictions, and getting really organized. And I think all of these things have led to an extremely strong response from real estate. And I think that response has had a couple faces. The public facing one has been through small landlords, and that's been around for a long time, obviously. That's kind of an archetype and a character that people are familiar with. But now we see it being updated in some key ways, mixing in some social justice language, again, to be really tailored to the moment. And I think what I was fascinated with in this piece overall is real estate people know what they're doing. They're extremely good organizers. We should not just think of them as people behind the strings, pulling the scenes, though that does happen, it has happened. They're also, effective at organizing themselves, effective at organizing a general public, effective at media outreach, and all of that needs to be taken into consideration.
Yeah, and for listeners who may not know, 2016 with an ascendant left in New York, specifically on state politics, there were a number of left adjacent and DSA backed legislators who were able to pass a package of bills in Albany that it was a life vest thrown to renters after literal decades of deregulation on variety of ways at housing. So in response to that 2019 package, and then with the pandemic just completely upending the housing market along with rising costs, these sort of series of movements were rising. All of this in the backdrop of a new, very focused national consciousness around social justice, racial justice, with a lot of vocabulary adaptable to all ends. And you highlight a small landlord named Lincoln Eccles, who, by his own admission, is reportedly the owner of more than about 100 multi-unit properties.
His uncle is.
Pardon me. Who he owes his break to. So Google him. He appears in the Times, the Daily News, the Post, CBS, just a number of national and local publications. And he is, very active on Twitter, as you point out. I was struck by the language and the sort of phrasing that he's using to defend property owners and landlords, using, as you quote, stabilization is the new redlining. He has favorably equated the defeat of new tenant protections, Supreme Court striking down racial gerrymandering in Alabama. And in 2021, tweeted that politicians seeking to halt evictions during the pandemic were saying Black property owners' lives, particularly those of Black women and children, don't matter. This is pretty stuff. Maybe you could talk a little bit about whether he is the face of some sort of movement, or is he representative of something within the small landlord industry at large?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that everyone who is involved in housing, organizing, and politics in New York State in a serious way is familiar with Lincoln and has for many years. And I think everyone has this crazy moment of like, oh wait, this person who is saying all these extremely egregious things is actually taken seriously, or is at least the face of kind of a very serious anti-regulatory movement. And I think Lincoln is a really perfect representation of kind of the confluence of a lot of different factors. I think he's a perfect example of small landlords kind of updating their woe is me story with the racial justice kind of lens that's happened more recently. I think he's a perfect confluence of how small landlords and larger your big corporate LLCs work together, which is another point I made in the piece. Is like it's not a one-way collaboration, and there's all these instances in history where actually the most gung-ho kind of fighters have been small landlords like Lincoln Eccles, pushing the bigger groups to use their money and use their lobbying influence. So I think he really typifies that a lot. And then I think, in general, just is someone who is really malleable to whatever message and whatever moment he goes. He's linked in with the American Enterprise Institute and is doing things with them, and then is able to come back to another, to go to CBS and say, wow, these protest movements are out of control because I'm on the left, and like they're so I think he's an incredible operator. And as someone who has spent countless hours of my life on Twitter, I have to tip my cap to someone else for whose brain has been melted by that as well.
Yeah, he's a poster. He's a true poster. And the reason why we're talking about his activity is not just because it's sort of striking or interesting. This is the face of a very, very powerful and very successful group
Yeah.
of organizations that represent landlords of various sizes. And I think what your piece is so, tackling this polemic of okay, well, what is a small landlord and
Yeah.
why is this particular group so powerful? I wanted to cite some of the data you
Yeah.
provided in the piece, which I thought really illustrates some of the central contradictions around this. Percent of the city's landlords own the vast majority of rental units at 71%. But the mom and pop sort of trope really obfuscates the central players of runs New York City and New York State housing politics. You also cite another stat here from Just Fix. Please shout out Just Fix. Landlords with 10 or fewer units own only 13.2% of the city's total stock and only 1.2% of all rent stabilized units. And just to be clear, rent stabilization is separate from rent control, which we could get into. But this scheme itself, which is limited to buildings of six or fewer units in a building, itself is designed to sort of stabilize mom and pop landlords. So itself, the thing that is protecting tenants is also protecting the small landlord, which is by itself very, very small number of folks. By contrast, the top 5% of New York City landlords control 65% of units and 87% of rent stabilized ones. Often hear that the response to rent stabilization, rent control, and this has sort of become a national topic of discourse, that those schemes of rent control, price controls, are hurting landlords. Maybe you could get into this contradiction, because I thought this data is really, really easier to understand.
Yeah. It may be the case that there are small landlords in New York City and across the country, legitimately small landlords. Maybe you own, your building and, a unit you live in and two above you. And I think most people would agree, if it means anything, a small mom and pop landlord kind of describes that scenario. There may be landlords like that who are rent stabilized or controlled, depending on where they are in the country, who that hurts their bottom line and they aren't able to operate. Smaller buildings have generally lower overhead. If you're an individual owner, you probably don't have access to the same amount of cash that BlackRock does to float some of their buildings. So there's a story there that I think intuitively makes sense to people. What's not true is that represents a lot of people. That is simply not a scenario in New York City that is kind of meaningful to talk about in a public policy sense, because it's so narrow, it's so specific. And conversely, it kind of just distracts away from the conversation that is important, which is about tenants, about the majority of people. I think even if there are thousands of small landlords who are struggling to keep the lights on and run their business, I actually don't really care. I care about the tenants who live there, who are not getting heat and hot water and adequate services. And if the small landlords have to sell, so be it. And I think there's a different interesting conversation there about how the left would want to intervene in those situations. But the most important thing is tenants are the majority of people in New York City and in any other urban setting. And what can we do to deliver deliver them the services and quality of life they need? And this trope kind of just serves as an ultimate distraction.
Yeah, two things. One, you provide some data on who renters are. The discourse, obviously, to the sort of myth of this mom or pop landlord losing money. But you cite here that almost 3/4 of non-white New Yorkers rent. They are more likely to live in rent-regulated housing, but are significantly more likely to be rent burdened. defined by paying more than 30% of your income towards rent, live with serious maintenance deficiencies, and face eviction. Black renters face these issues at the highest rates. This is all to say, and this is quoting you, most tenants and most non-white New Yorkers do not have mom and pop landlords. They deal with faceless multi-property conglomerates. Conversely, most mom and pop landlords, by any reasonable definition, are not being squashed under the boot of rent regulation. If anybody is interested in this data, Avi Garelick and I provided it in two separate pieces on the rent on rent data, which I'm happy to lay out in the session description here. The things that you are really making me think of, and I think this is a really central contradiction here, is that landlords are actually losing money. Why is it that they feel that they have the right to get the state to intervene to make them whole? Usually the sort of free market, relies on taking risk, making investments, and sometimes that doesn't pay off. So two things. One, we found in our own data and our own research, most of these folks are actually lying about losing money.
Yeah.
And if they are losing money, I do not understand why this entire sort of regime of owning an apartment allows you to have some sort of state of exception where the state is required to come in and make you whole. Nobody landlords to do this. Nobody is forcing you to become a landlord. Nobody is forcing you to take on the risk required to become a landlord. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience as a tenant organizer and as a writer dealing with this central contradiction?
Yeah, I think this is so key to the kind of entire engine here. So I first in the piece kind of track a usage in like 1985 of kind of this first term of a landlord saying they're threatened by rent stabilization and they own like a 60-unit building and they're clearly not. And there's this New York Post article written at the time that even has in it like, oh, actually, all rent stabilized landlords are profiting. I forget the exact number, but year over year they're successful, and there's actually all of these programs that if you are not successful, you can apply for an exemption to jack up increases. Many of those programs still exist today. I think I saw a news story this week. I forget exactly where it came out of. But again, if you look at year over year rental incomes for rent stabilized landlords, they took a brief hit in the pandemic. But by brief hit, I mean they went from a pretty high rate of profit to a slightly lower one, and now they're going back up again. And so, yeah, for one, I think a lot of this is fraudulent. And I think why it hits landlords so specifically is because of the American mythology of being a property owner and a homeowner. That this thing is not only so central to the point of our country, is that, living the American dream and having this, but it's also the promise of financial stability. Financial success is I will have a home and be able to sell it some years later and profit off that, or I have a home and I'm able to rent it out and profit off it that way. And when people are faced with realizing that there are the same rules and regulations that, like you pointed out, face any other investment you would have, I think it breaks something in people's brains, to be honest.
Yeah, the idea that the state has to make you not only whole, but to make sure that you are visiting.
Yeah.
Stunning zone of exception that I'm not sure exists in any other field or investment. Or people lose money in the stock market constantly.
Yeah.
People lose money on investments all the time. The idea that the government, or specifically a local government, is there to be your backstop not
Yeah.
just to lose money, which you're not, but to make sure that your rates of profit are are where you define them to be or where you want them to be is stunning.
Yeah.
I'm still, I think it's something we'll be sort of wrestling with our entire lives.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a few different instances in this piece where I was really interested in kind of trying to nail down how much of what the real estate industry is pushing out is just bullshit and they know it's an effective line, and how much are there actually true believers who genuinely yeah, believe that they are oppressed and believe that it's the duty of their local like city councilman to make sure they maintain a continuous rate of profit. And I really think that there is a mix of both. And I think people like Lincoln Eccles, without knowing his inner mind, I'm not sure that I would want to, I think are more in the true believer category, who don't even necessarily see themselves as a businessman and really see themselves as like, I am doing a public service for the world.
Right. And it's also not just a political identity, but seemingly in this day and age, like a brand identity. You know, everyone is able to sort of have their job in civil service or otherwise, or your identity as someone as it relates to your family. You know, it's the cliche. I'm a grandpa with 5 TVs in my house, and I love to truck drive. You know, on Facebook, everybody's got that, and the idea of sort of taking on this, under siege landlord is a really perfect identity to sort of wrap yourself around. Um, Part of what I loved about your piece is that you go through the history and this sort of and the contours of these groups that back landlords, large and small. Um, they organize themselves and debate amongst themselves are contingent on a larger macroeconomic political economy. You go into some details here about the 1970s financial crisis, and Rebney, maybe you could walk us through the state of housing in that post-war liberal order,
Yeah.
post 1970s, sort of how this discourse has evolved, where the organizations, ebbed and flowed, and how that relates to our current moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is one major real estate group in New York that's existed, I think, since the late 1890s, possibly early turn of the century. Rebney. They are, if you think of just any family with a name on a building anywhere, is probably right by them. They are doing $5,000 a plate fundraisers for politicians. Very white shoe. They are not really always rolling up their sleeves and getting dirty in the same way as some of these other groups. So they've existed forever. And in the 70s, they kind of realized, hey, maybe instead of being like a buddy social club, we need to start getting involved in politics a bit more. At the same time, there's a couple groups popping up. One that has become very influential today, especially in the last 2 or 3 years, is CHIP, the Community Housing Improvement Program. They pop up, I believe, in 1966, and they kind of say, we want to represent small landlords, large landlords. They keep it a little bit vague, but they kind of have a vibe of the little guy. And they're certainly, smaller in terms of their membership. Then you have the RSA, the Rent Stabilization Association, which is still today the most populous landlord interest group in New York. And their story is fascinating. As rent stabilization and rent control and all these forms of rent regulation were kind of shifting and being watered down, Mayor Lindsay had the bright idea of landlords self-governing and being able to write the rules of rent stabilization and enforce them. So in, I believe in 1968 or 69, he said, great, we're going to start this thing called the Rent Stabilization Association. Every rent stabilized landlord is required to become a member and pay membership fees. And then you guys will adjudicate any debates about regulation. they immediately say, great, amazing, we're going to take all of this money, and instead of regulating ourselves in any way, we're going to create front groups to run political campaigns, lawsuits. We're just going to like fight the government at all costs. Eventually, they get the state takes back control from the city. The RSA gets kind of severed as a official arm of the government, and they get to take all of their millions of dollars in membership dues and kind of this organization of pre-existing members, and officially launch even harder into being a full industry trade group. There are a few others. A few smaller groups that are fun to talk about. Those are the big three still today in New York. And I think what's interesting is that to kind of look at the context they popped up, and they popped up kind of while the seeds of the Reagan Revolution are getting sowed, and it's kind of there's a national deregulatory mood starting to rise. And I think simultaneous with the rise of all these groups in this organization is the rise of the small landlord myth for the first time, that I think comes from a few different places, but you start to see it in New York as these groups start to get really organized. And I think we're in a mirror moment today where you're seeing kind of this woke mom and pop landlord be utilized a lot more. And then you go behind the scenes and you're seeing these groups collaborating, organizing, kind of shifting their internal structures. And I think that what I learned from that is that anytime there's a rhetorical shift that is really getting pushed out a lot more, you can bet that behind the scenes, there has been a lot of organizational work to make that happen.
And when you say organizational work, you mean hiring PR consultants, hiring lobbyists.
I mean that, and I also mean that these are groups. These groups don't always get along. These landlord groups in the mid '80s, at one point, CHIP, which is again kind of like smaller mid-sized landlords, supposedly takes all its members to the Rent Stabilization Association and does a coup of the board. They say you are all hoity-toity and you're profiting too much and you're not taking it to the government hard enough. We are going to replace all the board members with our hard line quote unquote smaller landlord guys, and they win. And after that, the RSA charts a much more aggressive direction. In the last year, you'll see news stories where it says CHIP is extremely unhappy with Rebney, which is again kind of the white shoe guys, for not fully unloading all of their money on aggressively campaigning against different tenant protections. So these groups don't always get along. That was very fascinating to me. And I think what I mean by organizational, collaboration is that when they are combining funds as they have to for, like you said, PR, lobbyists, lawsuits, donations for politicians, that means that there has been something that's happened behind the scenes where they've kind of collaborated and hammered out a mutual agenda, which doesn't always happen.
Yeah, I think that's such an important message for listeners to understand that, just as if there are major blocks and major disagreement amongst left liberal, progressive, organization, intra, all of those things with many factions, there are many factions within the landlord category and these organizations. And those disagreements are, I think, in terms of a strategy or a tactic, useful for folks on our side of things to think through very, very deeply, to try and exploit. And so what I find fascinating is this dispute between larger landlords, represented by Rebney, and smaller landlords, represented by CHIP and RSA, specifically here in New York. The discourse around deregulation seems to come from big landlords, because they have the investments behind them, because they have the capital in reserves to sort of wait certain situations and scenarios out. That hardline tone, that sort of social justice language being used to bash tenants, seemingly exists largely on the small landlords.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting. And I mean, I think that a lot of these groups like the RSA, it's like they have both larger and smaller landlords within it, so it can be sometimes difficult to parse exactly where something is coming from. But I think, I really tried to figure out what is everyone getting out of this equation, like why has all the groups come to agreement of, or this is our path forward. And I think it's actually an incredible lesson for us to learn on the tenant side and on the left, is that I think there are ways that landlords who are perhaps less affected, like maybe a small landlord of a not regulated unit of, they don't own rent stabilized housing. I think there is actually a really intelligent understanding of, like, this is an existential threat. Like, even if this doesn't affect me and my and the housing I own, this is a win for tenants. That's bad for me. This is a win for regulation. This will like hurt the industry overall. So I think on a certain level, people who aren't affected do understand that. And I also think that it's nice to be part of the club. And I think that when the biggest and richest landlords say, like, we want to collaborate, we want to be involved with you and kind of have your struggles be the face of it, I think there's certainly some self promoters who like that, but there's also people who, again, are able to sense that it's more powerful for all parts of this industry to work together in whatever way that happens.
Let's pivot now to the contemporary situation, specifically around courts. And when I say courts, I mean the literal Supreme Court. So we're at a very tenuous moment right now where generally the national sort of rent burden is skyrocketing. And any listener of any podcast, forget this, can see in all mainstream outlets just charts and graphics and data that point to just how expensive it is to just rent in and rent around the world. And I think this is a good opportunity for us to just pause and take reflection that, this is a global scenario, this high cost of living. And I think we do need to think through how we could be connecting with tenant movements across the globe. So in the US particularly, you said that rent prices are just up over 30% from 2019. The average American tenant is now rent burdened, and the eviction filings are 50% higher than in the pre-pandemic average in some cities. Homelessness, which is a major, major problem in New York, has reached record highs, and the few restrictions on rent hikes that exist could be made unconstitutional overnight. What's going on with the Supreme Court? And maybe you could fill listeners in. Recently, they were hearing on rent stabilization from groups that include CHIP.
Yeah. So we've talked thus far kind of about the public facing response from landlords to, I guess, specifically the 2019 rent laws passed here, where they kind of went back on offense and deployed this trope in this new way. And we're kind of like working legislatively to try and, beat back the tenant movement. The other thing that happened after 2019 was a bunch of lawsuits filed to overturn rent stabilization, which is something that they've kind of done with some regularity over the years, never successfully. But 5 lawsuits were launched by a variety of different groups. 3 of them were being considered by the Supreme Court for kind of their upcoming session. Last week on Monday, we found out that the main one the tenants were worried about, which was filed by the RSA and CHIP, and it was backed by an incredible amount of firepower with folks like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the Manhattan Institute, like all of these big conservative interest groups filed, friends of the court, filed to be friends of the court. Also, you had Harlan Crow, who obviously is very tight with Clarence Thomas, and you have another kind of billionaire conservative backer who is tight with Alito, I believe, who were very publicly pushing this lawsuit. That specific one of the 5. the Supreme Court declined to hear that case, which is a huge victory for tenants.
Do we know why they declined to hear the case?
They did not provide an explanation, which they could have done. There was some optimism from the tenant movement lawyers throughout, which is something you almost never hear ever, that the Supreme Court many times has upheld rent control. In 1992, Clarence Thomas and Scalia voted to uphold rent control in a very similar case. It was a unanimous decision. This case had been decided on two lower courts by Bush appointees who wrote the most forceful possible defenses of rent control and said, basically, this is ridiculous. You have no, you have no case here. I think that I was really worried. We were really worried about, not the merits of the case, but just now that the Supreme Court has become so conservative that they would just say, hey, screw all these precedents. We have our people in and we can toss this. But I think what was different than if you look at abortion, affirmative action, is that those were very controversial cases. Those were also cases that were overturning judicial precedent and not a legislation like here. And they had maybe gone one way in one court and one in the other. And it seems as though there's maybe a bit more of a pattern of this conservative Supreme Court being willing to wade into controversial cases, and this one was so open and shut, perhaps, that they didn't. But nevertheless, there are two remaining cases that were filed by quote unquote small landlords. There's like a family in Queens that owns a bunch of buildings. There's a 24 property kind of LLC across Manhattan that's filed another one. There's a bunch of these guys. Two that the Supreme Court has not made a statement on whether they're going to rule on or not, or whether they're going to hear or not. And there's two more similar cases that still have not been dismissed by the immediately preceding lower level court. So there's two this round and probably two in the next round that we're going to be holding our breath to hear. But because the cases are all quite similar, and because we were most worried about the one with kind of the most connections, which is the CHIP RSA one, I think we're kind of letting out a little bit of a exhale and there's a little bit of relief on the horizon.
This is a very tenuous, very contingent moment, and we will keep our eyes open and our especially on this matter of rent control, price control, the consequences of something or a precedent being set. Would that strike down in one place and kick things back to the states? How do the tenant lawyers anticipate, should the Supreme Court go in this direction? Will New York, maybe New York leadership succumb to pressure by the real estate industry and deregulate itself at a high level? Or will you see other states, just like abortion, who have been trying to, remove that from the books for a while, get rid of it entirely, leading to, real uneven situations across state lines? What are we looking at here?
It could depend. The way it's been explained to me, it's that the Supreme Court could basically entirely strike down any basis for rent control in the country. They could write a new rule and kick it back down to the lower court and say, okay, now rule with us having made this specific thing in mind. They could make parts of it illegal and parts of it uphold. They could, of course, completely uphold. I don't know that we're confident in that happening. So we really don't know. I think a really lucid thing that the executive director of CHIP, who I know you're familiar with, a guy named Jay Martin, had said publicly is he more or less publicly admitted, like, one of the points of this lawsuit, obviously we want to win, but if not, we also just want to create political pressure on the legislature in New York to do what we want. That hopefully we can use this as a moment to make them negotiate for pro landlord policies. I think conversely, tenants, when the tenant movement was talking about, like, well, what will we do if they hear the case? we wanted to figure out ways that we could codify rent control that would get around any ruling, but we just don't know on what grounds this could be decided. So a lot will be contingent on what might happen in the future, but I think I would expect landlords to keep filing these cases. One, on the off chance that they win and there's a Supreme Court willing to hear it, and two, because it costs millions of dollars. They have millions of dollars, we don't, and they can just keep bleeding the tenant movement over and over again, and that's not a bad strategy to use for a lot of reasons for them.
Where do you see, as one of the leaders of, or one of the leaders participating with leadership of the tenant movement in New York, where do you see things standing right now at the state level? Where do what can listeners do to understand groups like Housing Justice for All? What currently working on? There's sort of a little doom loop happening, where there's a lot of discontent among generally. Left movements generally are on their back foot right now, due to the economy, due to political cycles. What message would you tell them?
I think that I don't really know what I would say. Like you said, it's a really difficult moment. To give a bit more specificity, we closed all these loopholes in 2019. We strengthened rent stabilization. We more or less banned deregulation of rent stabilized housing that had lost over 300,000 units. And so this big win, and after that, it has been tough sledding. I think we won comparatively good, strong eviction moratoriums and rental will nothing transformative, nothing really like, wow, this was a radical movement winning. But I think some people will be more proud of that than maybe stuff that went on in some other states. But we have not won a proactive tenant victory. There are some bills that again close some smaller loopholes and clean things up that passed the legislature last year, that our beautiful, wonderful, intelligent governor Kathy Hochul has refused to sign. So we are stymied on that front again and trying to push her. There will be some fun rallies upcoming around that. But I think there's a more difficult question where good cause eviction is specifically a bill to kind of extend some tenant protections to currently unregulated tenants in smaller units, oftentimes of smaller landlords, not always. I think that's one of the reasons why small landlords narratives have arisen, is to push back against this bill. And that has been stymied for 4 straight years. Well, 5 if you include 2019 when it was the one kind of thing that we didn't pass. And I think there is a crossroads within the tenant movement of trying to figure out, is this something we should water down more to try and avoid like, we're going to hear this big small landlord line. Should we water it down more to exempt more people, and then we won't hear that line anymore and it'll be more successful? Or should we maybe try and push for something more universal? I think that's being figured out and debated right now, and I think there will probably be some more universal stuff on the platform. But I think what I hope to kind of argue in this piece is that this line is going to plague whatever the tenant movement wants. The small landlord pushback is going to happen. Even if you have a bill that specifically exempted every single small landlord by name, the pushback is still going to happen. And you need to, there's a strength in fighting for universal, clear, easy to understand policy programs. And there's a hindrance when you have a more specific, really complicated one where, it's already going to be misconstrued and misrepresented. And it becomes even more difficult when you have kind of a complicated bill. So, we'll see. And I think that's where the tenant movement is at right now.
What are you working on next? Are there any big pieces on the horizon that you're inspired to write?
I have a similar piece in the works for the New York Review of Architecture on a number of different apps and companies that are looking to hack housing. It's like kind of all this Silicon Valley language of like, we're going to hack the housing crisis. And I mean, some of them are just like, we're basically going to take rent stabilized housing and make them into dorms, which is A, illegal, B, shitty, and C, stupid. And then, and then you have guys like the WeWork guy who's like, we're going to create, it's kind of also dormitory style housing, but it's like, we're going to give people the feeling of ownership. We're gonna give tenants the feeling of ownership. And so I'm kind of getting into again like the language question of where does this language come from for them? Why are they wanting to adopt like solving the housing crisis language, and then kind of expose how these not only are not going to solve the housing crisis, but in many cases make it worse. So
yeah, and to be clear, I'm up because Adam Newman, founder of WeWork, seemingly unstoppable, undefeated, just backed by Andreessen Horowitz to pursue Flow, this mysterious real estate startup that has no business model, no public available information about it.
I think he gave them like $400 million or something like that.
he's received a substantial investment from Andreessen Horowitz, which is a major player. This is not some fringe VC firm. This is one of the major financial institutions in the country, if not the world. He's seemingly able to get past everything. I think that's we'll be looking out for your piece. I think that's
look at that.
Very,
like,
very.
Man, I chose the wrong racket. Like, let me get a couple $100 million to hack housing.
How solve the housing crisis? On that note, seemingly everybody has an opinion about zoning and the supply question these days. Whether or not more luxury housing will lower prices. Maybe before we end here. Has the YIMBY NIMBY discourse creeped into the tenant movement? Have you seen any difficulties or sort of interesting contradictions in that way?
Sure. One of the other effective lines that was pushed against the tenant movement last year was Governor Hochul has pushed kind of a mass upzoning plan. Tenants were pushing good cause eviction mainly, among other tenant protections. And there was a real attempt to try and pit them against each other and say, oh, well, we won't pass one without the other. I think a lot of pro-tenant legislators ended up saying, we will support both. And I don't know that was that sentiment was returned by the governor or by other people who were more on the pure development side. I think there were some groups who were slightly YIMBY-ish and some groups that were slightly more tenant protection side that did agree to push it together, and it didn't matter. It's like the forces of real estate are so powerful, and they're so aligned against tenant protections that I think there was a thought of like, yeah, let's forge a third way, and that didn't really go anywhere.
Yeah, I would encourage folks to read more about what you've written, and there's a great piece specifically on the zoning economics over at Jacobin from about a month ago that I'll make sure we link in the description here, explaining these sort of contradictions of why this sort of tool that is very popular amongst a wonkish left liberal developmentalist sort of type is popular, but zoning itself, upzoning land makes the land more expensive, which trickles down to more expensive units overall and displacement. I'm fascinated by the supply side question and the supply side discourse, so we're going to have you back on to discuss about that from the tenant perspective, and maybe we can pair you with some great economists, and we can sort of forge our own third way in that way.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
For those who are looking to read more of you, where can they find you?
This piece in the Baffler, another one in the Baffler, New York Review of Architecture. I think that's about it for now, but stay tuned. Hopefully more coming soon.
everyone go subscribe to the New York Review of Architecture.
Absolutely.
It is outstanding. I've worked with them, Avi and myself. We're able to have the honor to write a piece for them. They are phenomenal. Charlie, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
Alrighty, I think that's gonna wrap it up for Nostalgia Trap / Housing Trap this week. I want to thank my guest host, Andrew Schustek, for putting these interviews together. I learn a lot from these, and I hope you do too. And I want to thank Charlie Dulik for coming on the show and talking about this stuff too. Go check out his piece in the Baffler. I will link it in the episode description, along with a link to our Patreon page where you can do a free trial and listen to all of our bonus stuff. That's where we get into the juicy conversations on the Patreon page. So come join us, and thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.